Alrighty, so let's get started. I'm Gloria Blackwell, Executive Vice President and Chief Program Officer at AAUW, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar in conversation with Dr. Koritha Mitchell from Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture. So first of all, I'd really like to thank Dr. Koritha Mitchell for joining me this afternoon. Thank you, Koritha.
Thank you. It is really, really a pleasure. AAUW's support has meant so much to me, and it's meant so much to me to be connected to you online and elsewhere all of these years since the fellowship. So I am absolutely delighted to talk to you today.
Great. And I think we're going to have such a great conversation. I mentioned before we started the webinar, I am for sure a Black History 365 days a year person. So I'm happy that AAUW, we're taking this time out during Black History Month to really have this conversation about the great work that you have done. So I'd like to introduce to everyone the AAUW Fellowships alumna and Associate Professor of English at The Ohio State University, Dr. Koritha Mitchell. She's an award-winning professor, author, and cultural critic. Her first book, Living with Lynching, won awards, including one from the Society for the Study of American Women Writers. She's also the editor of the Broadview edition of Francis E.W. Harper's 1892 novel, Iola Leroy, and her scholarly articles include James Baldwin, Performance Theorist, Sings the Blues for Mr. Charlie, published by American Quarterly, and Love in Action, which appeared in Callaloo and draws parallels between lynching and violence against LGBTQ communities. She's lectured at the Library of Congress, and in 2018, she was named Undergraduate Professor of the Year by the Ohio State University's English Undergraduate Organization. Her second monograph, From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture, was released in August 2020 and was named a Best Book of 2020 by Ms. Magazine. So that brings us to today's program. Its outstanding reviews note that in From Slave Cabins to the White House, Dr. Mitchell traces how African Americans define and redefine success in a nation determined to deprive them of it, and explores the works of Frances Harper, Zora Neale Hurston, Lorraine Hansberry, Toni Morrison, and others. Artists who honor Black homes from slavery and post-emancipation through the civil rights era to the so-called post-racial America. She follows Black families asserting their citizenship in domestic settings, while the larger society and culture marginalize and attack them, not because they are deviants or failures, but because they meet American standards. The book connects the links between African American women's homemaking and citizenship in history and across literature. Again, welcome, Dr. Mitchell. So let's get started. Uh, and I love the way in your book you brought together so many of my favorite literary pieces. So I was very excited to see that, and also seeing it from a perspective that I think many of us had not considered. So I want to ask, first of all, how did you decide and why did you decide to write this particular book?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, I'm just delighted to be with you today. I'm a little giddy, so I'm going to try to calm down. Yeah, the book in so many ways really continues the project of living with lynching. And I say that because Living with Lynching was an examination of plays about lynching written before 1930. Many of those plays were one act plays, and so they were really obscure. No one paid attention to those plays from the 19 teens and 20s, and they were just kind of a lost part of what we would call the Harlem Renaissance. And so Living with Lynching really was my way of saying, even though we haven't appreciated these one act plays, let me prove to you why they actually are really important, and let me help you understand how important these plays were to Black communities who were surviving and thriving in the midst of extreme violence. So, part of the way to answer your question is to admit to you that those obscure plays, in some ways, inspired my investigation in this study of canonical works. So, part of the reason I wanted to look at canonical works by Black women is because I had looked at kind of obscure plays. But let me back up. So, these lynching plays written before 1930 were obscure, but the main thing that I learned from studying them was that African Americans understood, even as they were living at the height of mob violence, they understood that the way you became a target of the mob was because you were successful. It was not because you were a criminal of some sort. It was not because you were doing something wrong. It was because you were successful and white supremacists wanted to put you in your proper place. Maybe you wanted to demand a decent price for your crop. Maybe you wanted to protect your daughter or wife from sexual harassment by white people who felt like they could do whatever they wanted. Well, in that case, you don't know your proper place. So let me put you back in your proper place. But more importantly, let me put your entire community back in their proper place by terrorizing them with your death. Because in so many ways, living with lynching is about how in the world did people cope when a lynch victim was taken out of the Black household. But again, the big takeaway from that study was that it was your success that made you a target of the mob. So as I looked toward another book project, my big question became, if Black people know that their success will make them a target, are there certain practices that they engage in that allow them to stay committed to marching toward success, even though they know they'll be countered at every turn? Are there practices they engage in to keep that persistence and to keep each other persistent? And my thought was there must be, because if you know that your success will make you a target, then clearly you've got to do something really, really deliberate. I guess the other way that I'll answer this question is to say that if Black success beckons the mob and African Americans knew that, even at the height of mob violence, then I started to say to myself, does it actually make sense that most of us are approaching Black literature and art looking through the lens of protest, looking for how they respond to the violence they face? No, because they're telling me that the violence they face comes because they're successful. So that means that if I really want to understand what's going on, maybe I should be looking at their definitions of success and how their definitions of success allow them to keep marching towards success, even if they have to change those definitions after they've been attacked so many times. So, in many ways, this study is my way of saying, if I understand Black success beckons the mob and that African Americans have always understood that, then I am not reading the record correctly if I'm constantly looking for how they're protesting their situation. No, it's not that they're protesting. White domination is pouncing at their every sign of success.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for making that connection between living with lynching and how it led you to this point. I think that's really important. And so you talk about citizenship, and you present us with a new way of thinking about citizenship. So could you define homemade citizenship for us, and its intersectional connection?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. So, I define homemade citizenship as a deep sense of success and belonging that does not rely on civic inclusion or mainstream recognition. And so, in so many ways, homemade citizenship is really the result of knowing that your success will inspire attack. So how is it that you can know that your success will inspire attack and still pursue it and feel a deep sense of success? I think that the only way you can do that is if civic inclusion is not what you're about, if mainstream recognition is not what you're about. So, in so many ways, the reason why homemade citizenship is so important to me as an alternative to US citizenship is because if all Black people were trying to do was to get civic inclusion and mainstream recognition, in so many ways, all they would be doing is just aligning their entire life project with settler colonialism. So, in other words, what I'm interested in by offering us homemade citizenship is to give us something more dynamic, something more multivalent, something more about belonging than it's about civic inclusion and mainstream recognition. It's more about belonging. And so, again, the reason why belonging becomes so important is because you know that your civic inclusion is exactly what the country is about. So much of what this country has done is to exclude African Americans. And so, if you understand that, then looking towards something more like belonging is going to be much more important. Part of what you have me thinking about too on this question of intersectionality is really important, right? Because the reason why I'm focusing on the literature and art of Black women in particular is because Kimberly Crenshaw has made it so clear that if you study the experiences of people who are experiencing violence from more than one source, then you will understand better what's happening for people who are not living at an intersection with so much violent traffic, right? So Black
Right.
women are dealing with a society that wants to put them back in their so-called proper place based on not only racism, but also based on sexism. So if
Right.
I'm going to try to figure out how do people continue to pursue success when they know they'll be countered at every turn, then paying attention to Black women helps me do that because they're dealing with being countered by sexism and being countered by racism, both at the same time, all the time. And so my goal is to look for what I would call strategies of perseverance. What are those strategies of perseverance that Black communities in general have had to tap into to keep pursuing success? And if I'm going to understand those strategies of perseverance for African Americans as a whole, certainly a window in will be Black women who are dealing with both racism and sexism.
Mhm. And that's a great way to approach it. You know, I hear the term strategies of perseverance. That's really profound. That's really profound.
Thank you,
Um,
because
it
part of
is.
what I appreciate you emphasizing that because part of what I want us to understand too is that so often, even scholars themselves have spoken in terms of this country's relentless and really Western society's relentless anti-Blackness. So we speak as if we understand that anti-Blackness is dictating so much of what happens, and yet we act as if that opposition is primary. No, if it's anti-Blackness, then I'm primary. And white supremacy is pouncing to try to counter me. I'm the primary thing. So I really wanted us to understand that it is not Black literature and art that responds, it is white supremacy that responds, it is domination of all sorts that responds. That's the reactionary project. So I love that that resonated with you, this idea of strategies of perseverance, because it's not about
Mhm.
Black and Brown people and other marginalized groups responding. They're
Absolutely. Thank
persevering.
you.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Uh, you know, and so being a successful homemaker was looked at really as kind of a radical act for Black women. Um, why, why do you think it was considered that it elicited such a violence from white people?
Yes, this is a crucial question. Thank you so much. And the reason it becomes so crucial is because basically the United States, for as long as it has claimed that the family is the bedrock of society, for as long as it has claimed that, it has claimed that Black and Brown people do not share those values. And so, over and over again, what we
Mhm.
watch is how the United States wants to offer a family portrait, but constantly exclude Black and Brown people from that family portrait. So, if I get specific and concrete with this and think about the slavery era, which I do in chapter 1, which looks at incidents in the life of a slave girl by Harriet Jacobs, as well as Elizabeth Keckley's Behind the
Mhm.
Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, right? A text that reflects the fact that she was the dressmaker to Abraham Lincoln's wife. Even when I look at the slavery
Right.
era, part of what you find is that over and over again, what the country is doing is insisting that Black people simply don't have the kind of intimate attachments that white people do. In order to justify slavery, you make that declaration, and you, in fact, use Black women as quote unquote breeders. You act as if their attachment to a partner that they might choose does not matter. The children that result from those interactions, the attachment that she feels to her children does not matter. You rip families apart. In order to justify doing that kind of thing, mainstream discourse had to insist that Black people simply didn't have these kinds of intimate attachments. So, from the very beginning, what you're insisting is that the thing that makes you a family, what makes you a recognizable human, what makes you a recognizable part of the body politic are things that simply are not shared by Black people. So, it seems to me that this is the reason this country has been so invested in responding so violently whenever Black people have anything that aligns with what the nation claims it respects, right? The nation claims it respects the heteronormative nuclear family with a breadwinning husband and his financially dependent wife and children. Supposedly, that is what we respect as a nation. Even if we get to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when the national government and mainstream culture in general is insisting that, well, these Black people, they just have these dysfunctional families. I mean, they just don't know how to value something like marriage, right? All of that discourse is suggesting that if Black people would just conform to this heteronormative nuclear model, then maybe we would know how to respect them. But the truth is, every time Black people adhere to that model, they are attacked. And part of what this book is doing is suggesting that we understand the many ways that that is attacked. It is not simply the kind of physical violence that I trace in the slavery era and directly after slavery in the lynching era. It is also the discursive violence of no matter how many heteronormative nuclear family examples exist in Black communities, they will constantly encounter representations of Black communities as being full of, I don't know, welfare queens, baby mamas, whatever, right? Anything other than that traditional nuclear family. If you are even in one, you're going to constantly see yourself erased in the public sphere. I want us to understand that erasure as part of the violence that is baked in to American culture. And that is the reason why Black people's citizenship has to be homemade, because they are attacked even in those ways of erasure, where their very existence as traditional families is being erased from mainstream culture. They are being written out, erased from the nation's family portrait itself.
It's great. And I think I heard you in another excuse me interview talk about how Black women were just out there accomplishing, and doing great things, and along came white people who sought to, as you said, erase those accomplishments. And so when you talk about
Absolutely.
success, yeah, and when you talk about success, it's also about uh, focusing on, defining, but also redefining success, right? Because it evolved over time. It also talks about defining success as opposed to liberation from oppression, right? That's a completely different perspective. And so, how is that different from the sort of generally accepted notion of citizenship and how we expect for people to assert their rights?
Thank you for that. Yes. Well, I guess part of what you have me thinking about is, again, if I go back to that slavery era and use incidents in the life of a slave girl as an example, part of what I'm interested in tracing, as you said, defining and redefining success, part of what I'm interested in tracing is the way that no matter how small your success is, you're attacked for it. And so there's a kind of granular attention that focusing on success forces on us. So when it comes to incidents in the life of a slave girl, part of what happens is that Linda Brent, the name that Harriet Jacobs gives herself as the protagonist of this novelized autobiography, right? So Harriet Jacobs calls herself Linda Brent as she writes this story that she calls Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is her slave narrative in a kind of novelized form. And part of what she does in that text is to show us Linda Brent with very clear definitions in her head about what being a successful woman will be. And for her, it is to be a free wife and mother. And by the time she's a teenager, she does actually fall in love with a free man of color who wants to purchase her freedom so that they can have a marriage that will be recognized because they are both free. What I want us to understand is simply the fact that she knew that she was human and her agency mattered. That was a victory in and of itself. Because you have an entire country telling you you are simply chattel. What you think and feel does not matter. So the fact that she thinks of herself as a human with her own agency and dreams and ideas is a victory in and of itself. That victory is answered by a nation that wants to convince her that she's property. When she falls in love with that free man that wants to buy her, I want us to understand that as another victory because she has held on to her sense of personhood and agency so much that she could actually make an intimate attachment of her choice. That is a victory, and it is countered by her so-called owner. And he says, if I see him around here again, I will shoot him like I would a dog. After that moment, you see Linda Brent redefining success. At that point, she decides that if I'm going to be successful, it no longer can be being this wife and mother that is respectable and free and out from under his clutches. Now I'm just going to make sure that I can at least determine who fathers my children, because clearly some children are about to be had in this situation. No matter what I do, I'm going to be the person who decides who the father of those children will be. And that is when she enters into a relationship with a younger white man in town that infuriates her so-called owner, and she is able to determine what happens to her. Again, the reason I'm interested in a framework more that focuses on success than something like liberation is because I feel like success allows us to pay attention to those very small victories in an incredibly violent, dehumanizing system. I need us to be able to have the tools we need to notice that even in this dehumanizing system, dehumanization never actually takes hold. But for us to understand that doesn't have to be centered on this idea of resistance all the time. It can simply be
Mhm.
focused on the idea of persisting. Because the reason that she's being attacked from the very beginning is that she knows she's a human. And that is a small victory, but it's a victory that the United States will not leave unchecked, right? This is the reason why you have the fugitive slave law. You have all of these ways in which both
Right.
physically and discursively and legally all of the power of the nation is being marshaled to convince you that you aren't even human. And I want us to have the tools to recognize that there are so many victories for us to take lessons from. But if we're looking at the grander scale and only thinking in terms of something like liberation, I think that that's part of the reason that we're only able to recognize grand victories. I want us to be able to understand those smaller victories too, because you can rest assured that white supremacy recognized the smallest of victories and pounced at every single one of them.
Absolutely, and I appreciate the focus on the acknowledgement of their own humanity. You know, recognizing their own humanity and how that played such a role in sort of the definition of what success looked like. You
Thank you
know,
for thank you
uh,
for pinpointing that too, because part of what I am trying to do in the book is to say that they took their humanity for granted. And in fact,
mhm,
white supremacists took their humanity for granted. It is because they knew we were human that they tried to dehumanize us so violently. I want us to understand
absolutely.
that as the reactionary project. So, a focus on success allows us to take humanity for granted and think about that success piece. Thank you so much for highlighting that.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and so you talked a bit, right, about how that success was defined. So there are some other, obviously, there are lots of examples in the book, but if we could talk a little bit about how Black women define success. For example, we saw Setha in Beloved and Beneatha in Raisin in the Sun. Um, Throughout all of the pieces, do you have one that sort of resonates with you the most?
Oh, this is so good. Thank
I
you.
know it's tough. I know it's tough though.
Well, and I'm gonna disobey because I'm actually gonna take the example you gave me. So first with Beneatha, right? So Beneatha is the young single woman in A Raisin in the Sun. And I'm
Right.
so interested in her definitions of success because so much of what I discovered in that chapter is that if you use success as your lens, you start to really appreciate how much the definition of success is at issue in that play. That debating the definition of success is really at the heart of A Raisin in the Sun. It's not simply about segregation and protesting segregation, it's about debating what
Right.
success looks like. So, Beneatha becomes important for at least two major reasons. First of all, she is someone who is questioning whether we should be buying into the definition of success that the dominant idea in African American communities in terms of civil rights. This idea that Black success is bound up with a suburban home. Black success is bound up with the Sunday best ethos of the civil rights movement. Those ideas of success that are kind of generated through an alignment with the Black Christian church, that is the first part that she questions, right? She is interested in challenging or at least questioning Christianity and the patriarchy that goes with it. So she helps to
Right.
drive debate on that issue. But the other part that I don't think is highlighted quite enough, and that I love this excuse to highlight it, is that she also has a Pan African bent to her definition of success. And
Right.
within that household, that isn't being very well received either, right? They actually make fun of her being interested in her wearing her natural hair. And they're like, well, why would you expect him to go out with you with your hair looking like that, right? So they are kind of
Right.
with this idea that isn't about a reclaiming that is aligned with Pan Africanism. So for me, Beneatha's definitions of success have to do with challenging Christianity and embracing Pan Africanism. Setha, as you mentioned, is another one that is huge for me. And really, Setha is the example I can use to admit to you that it really is the most surprising outcome for me in the book, right? Because as I admitted
Okay.
to you at the very beginning, I wanted to look at canonical texts in this study. I wanted to look at at texts that we all believe we know backward and forward, and Beloved is certainly one of those books. And so my challenge to myself, coming off of living with lynching with these obscure texts, it's like, okay, Koritha, you convince people that these obscure texts were more important than they thought. Can you now use a different lens to look at texts that people believe they know backward and forward? Can you use a different lens that actually teaches them something they had never seen in that text? And so for
Right.
Beloved, that is the place where that happened the most for me in my own experience with it. So briefly, what I believe I'm tracing in Beloved is Setha's defining again a definition of success that she is not sure can involve both a partner of her choice and children. In other words, when we think about incidents in the life of a slave girl, the examples I've been giving before, part of what we know happens there is that Harriet Jacobs wants us to understand how important it is to be able to choose one's romantic partner. That is a big part of
Right.
how she's defining success. By the time we get to Beloved in 1987 and Toni Morrison is revisiting the slavery era in the 80s, it is so clear to me that as she focuses on Black women's experiences in slavery, she understands that it is the way that this country's violence against Black women has so often
Hmm.
been about, okay, maybe I'll acknowledge your intimate attachment to your children. Maybe I'll tolerate that. I mean, I may just take them from you, but sometimes I'll tolerate your attachment to your children, but I will never tolerate your
Right.
choosing a partner of your own choice. And to me, that is what Beloved ends up doing. It helps us to see Setha's struggle with thinking about, can she define success, a home of her own that is a home that can protect her choice to love on purpose her children and a partner of her choice.
Mm, I love that, and also the fact that when we talk about the ways in which, having read so many of these texts and the way that we interpreted them. I mean, even looking at someone as as complex as Setha, we can still see it's even more. She's even more complex than we thought. So
Exactly,
it's beautiful.
exactly. And that's
It's
the
it's
other
really
thing.
beautiful.
That's the other thing I'll say too is that I really hope it's clear throughout the book that people don't need to go back and read all of these texts to understand the way that reading through the lens of success will give you a whole different appreciation of the text, right? That is really my goal by using these canonical texts, is to really drive home this idea that we have all been taught to approach African American literature looking for protest. What happens if you look for how success is defined,
Right.
redefined, and pursued?
Right. It's a totally different pivot when you're going back and looking at it from that perspective, for sure. Um, so I thought one of the more interesting parts of the book was the ending the book with Michelle Obama. Um, so how was that piece informed by the other pieces, and how did it come about that you made your way looking at these incredible literary pieces, and then you shifted to the White House piece?
Thank you. That's such an important question. Um, and always, I have to admit first that I owe a great debt to Gabrielle Foreman because she is a senior scholar, literary scholar who knew that I had been thinking through Michelle Obama and had heard me speak about some of my insights about Michelle Obama, but I admitted to her that I had no plans of including Michelle Obama in this book. And she was just like, why not? And after that conversation, I no longer could see Michelle Obama outside of this text. So the reason Michelle Obama ends up being an important figure in this book really has to do with the way that I see her declaring herself as mom in chief, as being a way of kind of putting the strong Black woman on steroids. So part of what part of what's interesting to me is the way that when you look through the lens of success and how Black women have defined and redefined success, part of what always informs my thinking is the Black club women of the 1890s and early 1900s. And part of what they
Mm,
did is they, saw themselves as examples of Black successful womanhood who could teach less educated wives and mothers how to, be more successful. And so they gave lessons on how to do one's hair, how to dress, how to clean and decorate one's home, right?
right.
So that is what Black club women did. So part of what I was interested in doing is seeing the way that in many ways Michelle Obama was continuing the tradition of Black club women of the 1890s and early 1900s. It's just that she was doing it on a broader stage because she was woman of the nation's house.
Hmm.
So, as always, what I'm interested in is reading a text through the lens of success rather than protest, and understanding that Michelle Obama's success by becoming the first Black First Lady was met with lots of violence, both discursive and otherwise, right? The idea that Fox News called her baby mama, the ways in
Right.
which people would, have these masculinized images of her, refer to her in monkey terms, like all of the ugliness of this country came out to greet Michelle Obama. And so part of what I wanted to do is make sure that we understood how her success on a grand scale attracted violence in the exact same way that every ordinary Black woman's success attracts violence, in small ways
Right.
and in big ways. The other thing I guess I should say, though, of course, is that especially because I built such a foundation with living with lynching in theater and performance studies. A performance studies lens is always part of what informs my work. So it's part of the reason I was so invested in having a chapter on Black drama that included Raisin in the Sun, as well as Alice Childress's Wine in the Wilderness. But when
Right.
it comes to Michelle Obama, she was a perfect opportunity for me to think about her First Lady persona as a performance text. So I take
Mm,
very seriously her decisions about how to style her hair, how she clothed herself, how she presented her body, as well as how she decided to decorate the White House, following in the footsteps of Jacqueline Kennedy, right, with borrowing various kinds of art to decorate the White House. I trace all of
mhm,
the ways that she made very deliberate decisions about decor. So again, the Black club women of the 1890s are talking about how to wear your hair, wear clothes, and decorate your house, and Michelle Obama is doing the
right.
exact same thing.
That's right. And you remind me of how, when interviewed, she would also say that she made sure that her girls made their beds every day and that they learned how to clean up their rooms and how they understood that they were in a special place, but there were still expectations of them. Because I think most people imagined that here were these children who were being coddled, but you know the first lady made sure whenever she talked about them to also say, I'm still a Black woman, and my children aren't going to be here in the White House ordering people around and telling them to clean up after them. So I think that really struck a chord as well, because that's a part of demonstrating the sort of, I'm still going to be the successful homemaker as mom in chief, for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And part of what's so powerful about your underscoring that, Gloria, is that it also gestures toward the real connection to ordinary Black people, right? I mean, part of
Right.
what you're underscoring is the way that she understood that these Black men and women, who some of them were on the staff at the White House, are part of the generations of Black men and women women that she writes about in her memoir becoming. And so
Right.
the connection to ordinary Black people, that's something we never lose, is also what you're helping us appreciate about her doing that with her children.
That's right. That's absolutely right. So I know that there was a lot of in-depth research that went into researching and writing the book. And so, what was sort of the most fascinating discovery you made during that process?
This is a great question, because in so many ways, in focusing on canonical texts, a big part of what I was invested in doing is going over ground that I felt like I knew like the back of my hand, and being surprised nonetheless. So I think one, in addition to the beloved example that I gave you, another one that really was a kind of exciting discovery for me was the way that I tried to honor a kind of what Brittany Cooper and Treva Lindsay and Esther Arma and Kaya Story. I think I've got all of them listed. They for a while were calling themselves the Pleasure Ninjas, and I I was very intellectually influenced by the work they were doing under the umbrella of Pleasure Ninjas because I had never taken pleasure as an important theoretical lens before. And their work around that really made me do that. And it completely changed the direction of the chapter in which I examined Nella Larson's Quicksand and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. To take
Um,
pleasure seriously made me see Janie Crawford in a very different way. And part of what it made most explicit in that chapter is the way that Nella Larson, in particular,
right.
she is showing us that Black women in the 1920s are not attracted by the heteronormative nuclear family. They do not want to get married. And if they could avoid it, they would.
Right. Right.
But they can't avoid it. And the reason they can't avoid it is because um, Black men, Black race men, are defining success by taking
Mhm.
pleasure completely out of their definition of success. They want a success that is only about propriety. And these are
Right.
Black women characters who want pleasure to be a part of their definition. So that's all I'll say is that this idea of the politics of pleasure and the way that Black women, even to this day, one of the it never ceases to amaze me how ugly opposition to Black women becomes when they're enjoying something.
Mm.
If they're enjoying scandal, like that's an example that comes to mind, you will see so many people denigrating them. Don't you think you have more important things to worry about as we face all of this racism? And so, like, why would you? I mean, Black women enjoying themselves, it's the easiest way to have yourself be denigrated. And so, this idea of a politics of pleasure and the way that Black women prioritizing their own pleasure, the way that that becomes something that you actually have to fight to hold on to, that was the biggest surprise. And I wouldn't have had it without that framework from the Pleasure Ninjas and the politics of pleasure.
That's great. I love hearing about the pleasure ninjas and this business about the ability to do two things at the same time. You can still protest oppression and actually also enjoy other things at the same time. It's not either, right? It's not either or. Uh,
Exactly.
and if you demonstrate that you might be paying particular attention to this other piece like scandal, then out come the attacks. It's something that's almost like clockwork on
It
social media.
really is. It really is. And that is the reason why their framework of the politics of pleasure was so important, because it helped me to understand that we do in this nation, it's part of the violence of the nation, have
Right.
very particular ideas about who can be a full citizen with access to pleasure. It
That's
is
right.
not Black women. Black women are supposed to exist simply to serve other people. If it's not white people, okay, fine, but it better be Black men and Black boys in particular. It better not be you and other Black women,
This is
right?
true.
That's the politics part of it. Who is supposed to have access to these things?
That's right. That's right. Uh, and so in looking at the book as a whole, um, what myths do you hope the book will dispel, or what do you hope readers will unlearn, right? Because I think part of it is all of the things that we have picked up along the way, or the way in which we have interpreted or understand things. There's a lot, I think, for people, across the spectrum to unlearn about the way in which we understand so many different concepts. So, what do you hope people will understand after taking this look?
Thank you so much. The main thing is that we have all, regardless of who we have all been taught to approach the literature and art of marginalized groups looking for protest and resistance. And because we have done that, we have taken on a lens that absolutely makes us think about them as secondary, as
Right,
always reacting. And so I want us to understand how powerful it is to understand that so-called dominance is actually very aware that it's not dominant. And that is
right,
the reason why it pounces every time, right? I mean, if I use the example of LGBTQ communities, right? It's not that straightness is the dominant thing. Straightness comes out in violent heteronormativity to convince
right.
everyone that it is dominant. It never has been, but that's why it has to pounce all the time, right? If
Hmm.
it was just natural, it wouldn't have to be so violently reinforced. So the biggest thing that I want this book to do is by showing us that looking at a marginalized group for how it is pursuing success rather than for this assumption that it's protesting, look at how powerfully that will shift your perspective. And hopefully
Right,
that will shift everything else. And, this is linked to the coda of the book, right? I call the coda from mom in chief to predator in chief. And part of
mm,
what that does in relationship to this great question is it helps us understand what we just went through. Why was it
right,
so important for 63 million Americans to make sure that we no longer had a mom in chief, but we had a predator in chief in the person of Donald Trump? Why was that so important to do? And it's because the best way to tell women, and especially women of color, to get back in their proper place is to put in power a figure as misogynistic and racist as him. But again, he couldn't have been put there without ordinary Americans being very okay with what
right,
he did from the very beginning. So part of what I trace is the way that birtherism, you can't understand birtherism unless you understand ordinary Americans who were okay with this totally unqualified person calling into question the credentials of a very well qualified person of color. You don't understand birtherism if you don't understand that. So I need us to
absolutely.
understand ordinary white Americans' complicity in everything that we just went through. And if you understand what I call know your place aggression, whereby everybody who isn't a straight white man is constantly put back in their so-called proper place. If you understand that, then you understand how we went from mom in chief to predator in chief. So all of those things have to do with what I think will be the lens that this book gives you, whereby you will
Hmm.
never see the workings of this country the same ever again, and you will never see the workings of your office the same way again, the
Right.
playground. Like if you understand know your place aggression, you'll never see any of these spaces of inequity the same way ever again.
Incredibly well stated. Know your place aggression. I think that's a key takeaway for people to get in reading the text, because the trauma from which we are only emerging, right, with tiny steps, is something that will last with people of color in particular for an incredibly long time. Um, so, when you think about, you know, pushing back on some of the myths that people have been holding on to, that's a prime example, right? That we're post-racial, right? And that was all a fluke, and that people aren't really like that. Well, that's actually not true. And when I think about the research that you're doing, right, you're talking about examination of these incredible texts, but also subjects like lynching. But you still seem to have a very positive, strong, attitude and outlook. And given the fact that you have to delve deep into what one might consider a painful dungeon to research those topics, how do you remain positive?
That's such a great question. And it does often come up, especially because my first book was Living with Lynching. So I've gotten this question in many forms over the years. And I think that the best way to answer that is at least twofold, right? First of all, that in so many ways, delving into a dungeon is not necessary because this country is so violent against me and mine. So that
Mhm.
it's never far below the surface, the hostility that this country has for me and mine. So it's not necessarily that there has to be delving. But the other part of how I have to answer that is that it is very much having done the study to understand what my forebears have done that gives me
Right.
the strength and the tools. So even though living with lynching is very much about lynching, it was very much about how in the world did those who survived the lynching cope and help each other cope. So throughout my career, I've been looking at this country's relentless violence against me and mine, but I've also been studying what we've used as tools to survive and thrive, even while being bombarded. But the other thing that I'll have to admit is that, I take very seriously having fun. I take very
Mhm.
seriously laughing and humor, and I mean raunchy humor, inappropriate humor, whatever. Like, I am very serious about making space and time for that in my life because I understand how violent this country is against me and it doesn't need my help in killing me. So I take humor very, very seriously. And then the last answer to that question is that I take very seriously walking and running as the kind of gift that only I can give myself. And again, this country is doing its best to beat me down and take away all joy and health from my life. It doesn't need my help. So, gifts that I can give myself that no one else can give me include walking and running and making time for that. And I take that very seriously. It's a gift that I give myself, and I am generous with myself on that front.
Yeah. Give yourself those generous gifts over and over again. That's really something beautiful to live by. And I think also the framing of the question around the sort of dungeon piece is interesting, because as you stated, I mean, for those of us who are Black women and people of color, it's not about delving, right? It's about every day showing up and having to deal with so many things that are on the surface, right? And that aren't hidden. So
Mhm.
that's it's a very important point that you made about it not being something that is, oh, I have to enter into the dungeon. It's because it's an above ground dungeon for sure.
Mhm.
Um,
And
so I
you
have
know
one more.
what? I'm sorry, but one more thing
Go
because
ahead.
you just underscored practice there. You just underscored again and again. And so then that makes me think of practice. Um, this is linked to what I said about practices of perseverance, right?
Hmm.
This is linked to what I call practices of making oneself at home in the book. So part of what you're making me remember is the way that, again, partly from a performance studies lens, but also from the lens of taking lessons from my forebears, part of what we can't overlook is the need for all of this to be a very deliberate practice. So that's the reason why
Right.
your point about again and again is so important, right? Giving myself the gift of running and walking again and again. It's a practice. And so practicing giving myself gifts like that is so important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. I think we are getting close, so I'm going to ask you just one last question. I think you alluded to it a little earlier, and it's around people. Uh, the book being accessible to people who may not have read, every piece, every one of the literary pieces in there, and that readers don't have to go back and read every piece in order to appreciate it. If you could just expand on that a bit more.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, because, as a literary scholar, so often people will ask me, can they even enter into this book if they haven't read all of the text that I'm talking about. And I want to
Right.
make it very clear that that is absolutely not necessary. And part of how to understand why it's not necessary is because a big framework that I use in the book is this idea of community conversation. What I'm interested in having us understand is that African American culture itself is made
Mhm.
up of a community conversation in which Black people are debating how to define success. And that is what I use the literary texts as a window into. So
Right.
the literary texts that I'm using are canonical, and they give us a sense of what are some of the dominant ideas in the community conversation that Black women are engaging with, and in some instances, challenging. And so you
Right.
don't have to read the book to see what the contours of that community conversation are and how Black women are making room for themselves within those community conversations.
Absolutely. And so I, of course, encourage everyone to buy the book. But thank you so much, Koritha. This has been just a fascinating conversation, and I know we could both go on and talk about this for a very, very long time. I want to thank you for one giving us your time and giving us the gift of your time, right? Because time is a gift, as well as your knowledge and your insight. We really do appreciate it. Just a reminder to everyone participating, thank you for sharing your time with us. This will be available on the AAUW website, and we hope that you will share it. I want to thank the AAUW team for your support tonight. Also, we have an opportunity if you're interested in purchasing um, Dr. Mitchell's book. You can get 30% off if you go to the University of Illinois site. We hope that you will because it really is. It's a fascinating read, and definitely we always appreciate the support that folks give to our AAUW Fellowship alumni. If you want to learn more about upcoming events, please visit aauw.org to look at the programs through our equity network. As always, we appreciate your contributions and donations so that we can continue to do these amazing programs. We will be sending out a survey after this presentation, and we hope that you'll give us some feedback and let us know what you think and give us some information on other topics that you might be interested in. I want to give Koritha the last word. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. Koritha?
Thank you again, Gloria, for making this happen. I have been absolutely honored to speak with you. Thank you to everyone who made time to attend or to watch this later. The last word I want to give is just a huge thank you to AAUW. The support for my scholarship really helped me make Living with Lynching an award-winning book. And as I discussed today, it became a foundation for this book. So I am very grateful to AAUW and truly honored to have shared time with the community that you're cultivating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your gift with us, and we wish you all the best. And we'll be in touch. Good night, everyone, and thanks again for joining us. Take care.